He slammed her into the hood and spat, "You smell like jail, sweetheart." They thought she was just another mouth from the projects. That was their first mistake. She didn't move. Her phone kept recording. Somewhere behind those locked doors someone was watching, and in 9 seconds a black SUV would arrive. But what happened next? They never expected. Before we dive into this real story of power, silence, and brutal consequences, take a second to tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe dignity should never be judged by color, tap like and subscribe, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. They held her against the car for another 20 seconds before cuffing her wrists too tight and dragging her inside. The station was small, dated, smelled like mildew, and stale coffee. One officer laughed under his breath, calling her mouthy, while the other nudged her forward with a hand too firm for protocol. Her silence made them uncomfortable. She didn't argue, didn't flinch, just stared at the hallway ahead, one step at a time. The front desk sergeant raised an eyebrow, asked what the charge was. "She got loud in a parking lot," the officer muttered, "disturbing the peace." The sergeant rolled his eyes but nodded. No ID had been verified. No Miranda rights read. Just an unspoken assumption she didn't belong here. 3 other officers lingered nearby, their chatter loose and sharp, laced with racial slurs veiled as jokes. She was ushered past them, her heels clicking slow against the tile, her coat slipping from one shoulder, but no one offered to help. One called out, "Trashy attitude, just like the hair." She didn't look back. They led her to a small side room. No windows, fluorescent, light flickering above. One guard told her to empty her pockets. She complied. Phone, keys, ID, a folded letter. The ID was scanned and tossed aside like gum wrapper. One officer glanced at it, scoffed, and dropped it onto the desk. They called her Ratchet trash. Again loud this time, while leaning close enough to make her flinch. But she didn't. She stared at the clock on the wall instead. 4:17 p.m. Her phone screen, face down on the desk, still recorded. They hadn't noticed. Not yet. A rookie cop leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, chewing gum like the scene bored him. She sat silently in the chair, hands clasped, watching them talk about her like she wasn't human. One of them joked about throwing her in the trunk tank just to see if she'd cry. Another asked if she had a record. Nobody bothered to check. It wasn't about evidence. It was about making her small. And it worked on the surface. But deep beneath that coat, behind those tired eyes, something sharper waited, something colder. A clock inside her was ticking, not from fear, but from preparation. Outside, unnoticed, by every officer inside, a black SUV parked across the street. Its engine quiet, windows tinted, someone inside watching the door and counting every second. They took her coat next. No explanation, just a sharp gesture toward the hook behind the metal chair. She stood, removed it slowly, folded it in half and placed it on the seat. One of the officers snatched it up and rifled through the pockets without gloves, tossing a lipstick tube to the floor. When she moved to pick it up, another officer stepped forward and blocked her with his leg. "Sit down," he snapped. She obeyed without a word. Another officer held up her ID again, squinting at it, then handed it to a third who simply shrugged and slipped it into his pocket. There was no system here, only the illusion of order wrapped around unchecked power. One officer, a stocky man with a crooked badge, asked if she was a threat. Another laughed. "Not unless eye rolls count as weapons." The rookie officer from earlier stepped into the room and leaned over her shoulder. "We're going to need to do a full search," he said. "You might be hiding something under that attitude." She turned her head just enough to meet his eyes but said nothing. He didn't like that. The sergeant entered and asked if she'd been booked yet. The room fell silent. "She resisting?" he asked. "No," someone replied. "Just sitting. There like she owns the place." The sergeant grunted and told them to move her to holding until they could find something to charge her with. The door to the hallway opened. She stood without being told. One officer pushed her forward harder than necessary. Her shoulder clipped the frame. She winced but didn't stop walking. They passed the break room where 2 officers sat watching a game show and didn't even glance up. She was led past rows of filing cabinets and locked drawers until they reached a steel door with a keypad. One officer entered a code, and they pushed her into a bare room with a bench bolted to the wall. The door shut behind her with a heavy echo. No clock, no window, no phone call. Her belongings, including her ID, were gone. She sat down slowly and stared at the wall. Her fingers found the seam inside her coat sleeve, now folded across the bench beside her. Within it, a microchip smaller than a coin had already activated, silently pinging her location to a secure channel. Back in the main room, the sergeant asked one of the officers if the cameras had been wiped from the last 30 minutes. "Yeah," he said. "Done already." The rookie leaned in again, this time whispering, "Think she knows who we are?" The others laughed. She doesn't even know where she is. But she did. She knew exactly where she was, and exactly what was about to happen. An hour passed without sound. The light buzzed above her, a slow pulse that dulled thought and blurred time. The metal bench under her turned colder with every minute. Her hands remained steady in her lap, her breath even, her eyes trained on the door. Then it opened. A young, black officer stepped inside, barely older than 25, eyes nervous, fingers twitching near his belt. He looked at her, then glanced over his shoulder before stepping all the way in. "Ma'am," he said softly, "are you okay?" She nodded once, measured. He lowered his voice, leaned closer. "I think they messed up. I saw your ID. Something's not right." She didn't reply. She just tilted her head, not in doubt. But in warning, he understood. His mouth pressed into a line. "Do you want me to call someone?" Before she could answer, the door slammed open behind him. The sergeant barked, "What the hell are you doing in here?" The young officer straightened. "She's been in here over an hour, no charges. I thought I could—" "You thought?" The sergeant cut him off, stepping forward. "This ain't your job. Step out." The rookie hesitated. The sergeant's voice dropped. "Unless you want your badge on my desk by noon." The kid looked back at her, a flash of guilt in his eyes, then walked out without another word. The door locked behind him. She blinked once and returned her gaze to the wall. Outside, down the hallway, the officers gathered near the main desk. One of them laughed about the rookie getting too soft. Another joked about sending him to the storage room until he toughened up. Cameras in the hallway dimmed to black for exactly 7 seconds. Nobody noticed but her. In that same span of time, the young officer who tried to help was reassigned to desk duty and told not to speak to detainees unless given permission. He sat at the front window staring at the parking lot, watching the black SUV that had not moved in over an hour. Inside the SUV, a woman with silver earrings and eyes like winter placed her phone on the console and said one word into the mic. "Clocked." Her voice was low, controlled, and somewhere across the state, a server began compiling audio files sent silently from a microchip embedded in the left seam of the coat that was now folded and tagged inside evidence locker B. Inside the holding room, the air felt heavier. The fluorescent light flickered twice, then stabilized. She hadn't moved from the bench. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, fingers still, breath steady. Then she blinked once and reached toward the inside hem of her blouse. Hidden beneath the stitching was a small button, barely larger than a grain of rice. She pressed it twice. Across town, inside an underground operations center, a screen lit up, and the red dot marking her location began flashing. The woman inside the SUV received the ping. She leaned forward, opened a secure tablet, and activated the secondary channel. Back at the precinct, a desk phone rang. The sergeant picked it up. The voice on the other end was calm, precise. "This is Special Systems Operations. You have an unauthorized detention. Identification tag 117AF23. Confirm or release." The sergeant frowned. "Who the hell is this?" The line went dead. He looked at the phone, then at the officers gathered near the coffee machine. "Prank call," he muttered, brushing it off. He didn't notice the red light on the call log blinking twice before vanishing. Meanwhile, the officer who had pocketed her ID walked into the evidence room, flipped through a few boxes and shoved the ID beneath a pile of paperwork. On the way out, he dropped her folded coat into a container marked unprocessed. None of them noticed the small transmitter inside the inner lining, now feeding live audio to 3 separate channels. Back in the holding cell, her fingers traced the scar on her wrist, a mark left from another time when someone underestimated her. Silence. A soft knock came at the metal door. It opened just enough for a different officer to step in, one she hadn't seen yet. He held up her phone and wallet. "You dropped these," he said. She didn't answer. He placed them on the bench and left without further comment. Her eyes narrowed. The phone screen lit up for a second, displaying a message only she could read. One word: confirmed. Her face didn't change, but the corner of her mouth twitched. They thought she was trapped. Thought she was alone. What they didn't realize was that the moment they ignored that call, the moment they mocked her silence, they stepped directly into a federal jurisdictional boundary already drawn around their building like a net. The black SUV remained parked across the street, but now its brake lights flashed once. Just once. Long before the badge, before the title, before anyone ever called her Mom with meaning, she was just a girl standing in the hallway of a courthouse, 12 years old, wearing shoes too big and hope too thin. Her father was inside, accused of something he didn't do, and she stood beside her mother, clutching a silent prayer between her fists. They lost that case, not because he was guilty, but because he was black, and the officer who testified had a uniform, a lie, and a badge that shielded both. She remembered the sound of the gavel, not the bang but the silence that came after. That silence stayed with her for years. She wore it like a second skin. In high school, she stopped raising her hand in class. She took notes instead, learned everything, quietly. She got into law school through 2 jobs and 1 scholarship no one thought she'd get. She didn't argue when professors ignored her. She just scored higher. After graduation, she applied to every civil rights office in the state and got turned down by all but one, the FBI. Not because they wanted her, but because they didn't see her coming. She entered through the systems division, climbed with silence and scars. She led investigations behind the curtain, cleaned up dirty precincts in 6 states, and never once gave a press interview. They called her invisible. That's how she liked it. She wasn't after headlines. She was after names. Over the years, she learned that justice wasn't a sword. It was a pressure point. Hit it right and everything collapses. The last operation she led took down 3 judges and a deputy mayor. But her name was never in the paperwork. By the time anyone figured out she'd been there, she was already gone. She moved like a shadow, thought like a scalpel. And right, now sitting inside a dusty holding cell in a precinct, built on outdated arrogance and peeling paint. She wasn't trapped. She was gathering. The officers thought they were in charge, but she had already pulled the pin. Her war didn't start today. It started in that courtroom years ago when her father looked back at her through the bars and mouthed, "Make them pay." And she had, quietly, precisely. And now, once again, the silence was about to shatter. At precisely 5:02 p.m., the door to the precinct buzzed, then clicked open without anyone touching the handle. A tall man in a federal suit stepped inside, his badge tucked just behind a folded piece of paper. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The desk sergeant stood up too fast, knocking over a half-empty coffee mug that spilled across an incident. Report no one had filed yet. The man handed over the paper. It was a notice of internal inquiry signed by a federal liaison 48 hours prior, authorizing unannounced entry in cases of unlawful detainment connected to civil rights violations. The sergeant stammered, tried to ask who filed it, but the man was already walking past him, heading straight toward the back hallway. Officers followed, unsure whether to stop him or clear the way. In the evidence room, the coat was already gone. Someone had moved it. The surveillance feed began glitching, skipping frames. In the holding area, she remained seated, eyes closed, body still, as if nothing around her had changed. The lock disengaged. The federal agent entered, stepped aside, and another figure walked in behind him. She opened her eyes and stood. No words, just a nod. She stepped out into the hallway, cuffs gone, coat in hand. The officers watching didn't move. Not one. Because at that moment, they realized 2 things. First, the detainment was no longer their decision. Second, they had no idea who they had arrested. As she walked through the corridor, her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. A second warrant had just been activated. This one wasn't for her. It was for them. The sergeant attempted to stop her, voice shaking, saying she couldn't just leave. She turned slowly, eyes calm. Then she spoke her first words since being brought in. "This is no longer your building." Outside, the black SUV's doors opened. Two more agents stepped out, one carrying a folder, the other wearing a body. Camera already blinking red. The precinct was now under review. The countdown had begun. Not with violence, not with noise, but with paperwork, federal jurisdiction, and silence sharp enough to draw blood. She walked out without raising her voice, without flashing a badge because she didn't need to. Every step was a reminder. They had messed with the wrong quiet. She crossed the parking lot without looking back, the coat now over her shoulder, the sun lowering behind her like it had been waiting for this moment. One of the federal agents opened the back door of the SUV and handed her a black folder. She flipped it open, reviewed the pages inside, and signed twice. A second vehicle pulled up beside them, sleek, windowless, and quiet. From the passenger side, a woman stepped out in a dark suit, carrying a sealed envelope and a portable scanner. Without a word, she walked toward the precinct entrance, presented the document to the sergeant, and placed the scanner on the desk. It beeped once. Then the printer behind the counter came to life, printing line after line of authorization, names, times, badge numbers, dates of misconduct. The sergeant stared, mouth open, as page after page confirmed what none of them had seen coming. Inside the envelope was a federal warrant drafted 2 days before the woman in the holding cell ever arrived. It had been waiting for activation. The officers had just supplied the final evidence to trigger it. At the same time, she re-entered the building, this time through the front door. No cuffs, no escort, no permission needed. She walked to the center of the lobby and looked each officer in the eye. Then, calm and unwavering, she pulled her phone from her coat pocket and played the audio. Their voices filled the room. The racial slurs, the illegal search, the threats. Every second recorded. No one spoke. She walked to the evidence locker and retrieved her belongings herself. The officer who had pocketed her ID stepped back but said nothing. She looked at him, held his gaze for 3 full seconds, then turned to the youngest officer in the room. "Remember what you almost did," she said. "Next time, finish it." She turned to leave, then paused at the threshold. Title 18, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. Federal offense. Minimum penalty starts at 1 year. Maximum is life. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The sound of her heels on the tile echoed like a verdict. The precinct wasn't just compromised. It was now part of a federal case, and they were all in it. By the time she reached the SUV, her badge had already been reactivated, but she hadn't needed to show it, not even once. The next morning, headlines in the local paper read, "Woman causes disturbance at police station," with a grainy still of her silhouette walking away from the building, deliberately blurred to conceal the agents around her. The article cited anonymous sources, claiming she had been confrontational, uncooperative, possibly intoxicated. The story spread across smaller outlets, echoing the same narrative, each one twisting the details just enough to make her look unstable. Within hours, her personal information leaked online. An anonymous account posted a distorted version of the audio, editing out the racial slurs and adding synthetic background noise to obscure the truth. The comments piled in, many filled with venom, others questioning her legitimacy, some even suggesting she had faked the entire detainment. A local news anchor mentioned her as a possible fraud, citing unnamed law enforcement officials who claimed she used intimidation tactics to avoid charges. Behind the scenes, the officer who had initiated her detainment sent a private email to several precincts, asking for support in framing a narrative that would discredit her. At the same time, a known far-right group posted a call to action on social media, urging its members to protest what they labeled as a federal overreach. That afternoon, A group of masked men appeared outside the school her daughter attended, standing just beyond the legal line, holding signs with slurs written in bold ink. The school principal called her immediately, voice shaking, asking if she could arrange alternative transportation. She answered calmly, thanked the woman, and made a single call. The SUV was at the school in 7 minutes. The masked men were recorded from 6 different angles and identified by facial recognition software within the hour. But the message was clear. They weren't backing down. That night, her neighbor received an envelope with her photo inside, circled in red ink. The neighbor brought it to her in silence. She opened it, scanned it once, then burned it in a steel tray without speaking. In Washington, an internal request surfaced seeking to reopen one of her past investigations under suspicion of procedural misconduct. The name behind the request matched a senior officer she had once had removed for evidence tampering. The system had started to bite back. It was coordinated, relentless, and cruel. But it wasn't unexpected. She had seen this before. Not this specific tactic, but the pattern. First smear, then isolate, then strike. But she wasn't isolated. And she wasn't unprepared. The next morning she walked into a federal office building carrying a sealed case file. She placed it on the director's desk, opened it to the first page, and said quietly, "Let's finish what they started." She returned to Atlanta 2 days later, moving quietly through the federal courthouse with a briefcase handcuffed to her wrist. Inside it were sealed transcripts, internal memos, suppressed reports, and a flash drive containing raw footage never meant to be seen. She stepped into the office of a federal judge she trusted, a woman who had once lost a brother to a falsified arrest and who understood that silence was often the loudest weapon. They spoke for less than 15 minutes. When she left, the judge had already begun issuing orders. The next morning, a motion was filed to unseal a civil rights case that had been buried 5 years prior, a case she had once investigated but was forced to close due to sudden jurisdictional interference. The defendants in that case included 2 officers from the same precinct that had held her. Their names now sat on record under federal scrutiny. Meanwhile, the precinct's chief received a formal summons to appear before a regional oversight board. He tore it up in his office, unaware that the order had already been logged, time-stamped, and signed by 2 federal attorneys. At the same time, a former officer who had retired early after filing a discrimination report at that same precinct surfaced. He had been unreachable for years, but now he had something to say. She met him at a diner off the interstate, just outside town. He wore sunglasses indoors and kept checking the exits. He handed her a folder wrapped in tape. Inside were photocopies of complaint records, most of them unsigned, all of them marked confidential. They showed patterns, years of it, stretching across shifts and commanders. She asked him one question. "Are you willing to speak publicly?" He paused for a long time, then nodded. "I'm tired of hiding," he said. That night, she submitted the packet to the Department of Justice. The following morning, the precinct's website went dark, their press contact line disconnected. No one would confirm who was in charge, and in the midst of the silence, she received an encrypted message from a federal contact. It contained one sentence: "The floor is yours." She walked into the courthouse at 9:43 a.m., past news vans, protest signs, and federal marshals. In her hand was a list of names. Some were guilty, some were silent, and some she knew were waiting for this very moment. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Everything behind her was already burning. By the time she entered the courthouse's second-floor briefing room, the leaked footage had already reached over 2 million views. The full video, untouched, uncut, and uploaded by an independent journalist who had received it through an encrypted drop, showed the racial slurs, the threats, the illegal search, and the smug laughter behind closed doors. It spread through forums, news segments, private group chats, and community channels. For the first time, the narrative slipped beyond their control. A public hearing was called, cameras lined the walls. She stood before the panel, flanked by federal agents on both sides, and laid out every name, every date, and every deliberate act of misconduct tied to that precinct. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words landed like verdicts. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, hundreds gathered, not in chaos, but in cold, furious unity. Teachers, veterans, pastors, single mothers, students, all of them watching the doors for the next move. But the response came fast. Local law enforcement, under pressure from city officials, attempted to disperse the crowd. Officers with riot shields stepped into formation. Helicopters hovered overhead. One protester was shoved to the ground, a girl no older than 15. The crowd surged forward, but she was already moving. She exited the courthouse steps and walked directly toward the front line. The officers paused. Her presence was not expected. She spoke only once. "The girl is a minor. You put hands on her again, you won't be facing a crowd. You'll be facing federal charges." Her voice was low, flat, and unmistakably final. The officer in charge looked at her, then at the badge now clipped plainly to her waist. He gave the signal. The line backed up slowly. The crowd stayed. The protest continued in silence. Later that night, the footage of her standing between the riot line and the people was replayed on national television with no commentary. It didn't need any. That image alone said enough. The pressure was mounting. Petitions were signed. Officials, who had been silent for years, began issuing statements. And inside the halls of the courthouse, the doors that had always been locked to her kind started to open. She hadn't won yet, but the system was no longer pretending. It had been exposed. And now it had to answer. The inquiry widened. Over. The next 48 hours, 13 sealed files were unlocked under emergency review, revealing patterns of misconduct long buried beneath red tape and internal memos. Officers from the precinct were called in for questioning, some under oath, others under quiet threat of federal indictment. 2 resigned within the same hour, one of them leaving behind a handwritten confession addressed to no one. It outlined falsified reports, planted evidence, and years of cover-ups that had been treated as routine. News outlets began running timelines. Charts showed links between local judges and selective prosecution records. Community groups held late-night strategy meetings. A map of affected neighborhoods was projected on a wall in a church basement where elders cried without raising their voices. She watched all of it unfold from a small office inside the courthouse, her coat draped over the back of a metal chair, a notepad beside her with 3 names underlined in red, each one tied to a decision that had silenced someone like her. Outside her door, a staff member entered carrying a list. One of the precinct's administrators had been suspended. 2 others were placed on temporary leave. But that wasn't the headline. The woman who had edited the false footage, a civilian employee under the Public Information Unit, had been fired and arrested for evidence tampering. Her desktop contained over 40 hours of raw video marked for deletion. Each one showed a different black resident being mistreated, dismissed, or ignored. The footage was now in federal hands. Simultaneously, a major news outlet issued a retraction of the original story that painted her as aggressive. It ran in bold print across the center of the Sunday edition. "We got it wrong." Her phone didn't stop ringing, but she answered almost none of them. She was already preparing for the next step. On her desk sat a folder labeled Internal Cultural Review. It wasn't just about the precinct anymore. It was about the architecture behind it, the policies, the alliances, the silence. One of her former mentors called late in the evening, voice low, asking if she wanted protection. She replied without pause, "No, I want the room." The next morning, she stood before a new panel of federal officials and presented her findings. Not just about her case, but about a network of misconduct held together by decades of selective forgetfulness. Some flinched, some listened. All of them knew they couldn't put the lid back on, not this time, not after what had already been seen. The system didn't collapse, it cracked, loud enough for the world to hear. The courthouse filled before sunrise, every seat taken, hallways lined with reporters, staffers, and silent watchers who had flown across states to witness the reckoning. The trial had shifted from a hearing into a full federal proceeding under civil rights enforcement, with one goal stated clearly at the top of the docket: determine the liability of individuals and structures that enabled targeted misconduct. under the color of law. She entered the courtroom not as a witness, but as lead investigator. The judge presiding was brought in from out of district to ensure neutrality. At the center of the defense sat the former precinct chief, surrounded by legal counsel, flanked by his 2 officers who had made the arrest that started everything. Cameras were not allowed, but the room held more weight than any lens could carry. She approached the stand, handed over a sealed drive, and spoke with the clarity of someone who had waited a lifetime for the truth to stop trembling. On that drive were compiled records, signed depositions, and 15 separate surveillance files, including one from the night before her detainment that showed an officer practicing the phrase she would later hear, "You smell like jail." The courtroom did not gasp, it held its breath. The defense attempted to object, claiming inadmissible chain of custody, but the judge reviewed the file silently, then nodded. Over the course of 6 hours, she presented a methodical breakdown of how policy became weapon, how silence became currency, how racism wrapped itself in protocol and called it order. When the defense finally rose, their strategy became clear. They pointed fingers at poor training, departmental confusion, miscommunication, even blaming her for not identifying herself sooner. But she never gave them the moment they wanted. No outrage, no stumble, only facts, only the law. Then came the footage, not the one already leaked, a new one. A backup recorded from her body transmitter, protected under federal chain and mirrored in real time. It captured not just the slurs, not just the threats, but the moment one officer whispered, "We can make her disappear if we need to." The courtroom froze. The judge called a recess. Outside, federal agents moved fast. By the time the session resumed, the precinct chief had been placed under arrest, right there in the hallway. When the court returned to order, she stood once more, not to speak, just to confirm. She handed the judge a single envelope. Inside it, the final charge sheet. The verdict would take days, maybe weeks, but the damage was done. Not to her, to them, and this time no one looked away. The chief was escorted out of the courthouse in handcuffs, head lowered, coat wrinkled from hours of sitting in denial. Flashbulbs lit the sidewalk as federal agents flanked him, one reading the official charge aloud without inflection. Civil, rights violation under federal code, evidence tampering, conspiracy to obstruct justice, abuse of authority under sworn duty. Inside the courtroom, silence stretched like a held breath. She stood near the back, coat folded over her arm, expression still. A reporter whispered her name, but she didn't answer. She wasn't there for headlines. She was there for the finish. A mother in the third row wiped her eyes as the judge read into record the legal grounds for immediate suspension of all officers tied to the misconduct chain. 24 personnel placed under review, 9 precinct files frozen. A special oversight committee formed to evaluate statewide compliance with federal standards. In the hallway, a girl held her grandmother's hand and asked if the lady in the black suit was the one who stopped the shouting men. The grandmother nodded without speaking. In her office that evening, she opened the case files that had been waiting, ones not related to her own, ones she had been forced to set aside during the investigation. She opened the first and began to read. She wasn't smiling, but her hands were steady. A knock came. A courier handed her a letter. No sender. She opened it and read the single line inside. "Thank you for making them listen." She folded the paper and placed it into a box labeled "Personal." Later that night, she stood by her apartment window and watched the street below. No sirens, no chants, just quiet, but not the kind she had known before, not the kind born of fear. This was different. The kind that follows after someone speaks, and the world finally hears. She looked down at the photograph on her desk, her father in his old uniform, before the courtroom, before the trial, before everything. She touched the edge of the frame. "I didn't fight to win," she said aloud. "I fought so this doesn't happen to her." Her voice barely reached the air, but it didn't have to. The fight was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who saw themselves in the silence. Weeks passed and the trial closed with a verdict that carried more than punishment. It carried message. The precinct was officially dissolved, its leadership banned from public office, its records transferred to federal custody. Community centers received sudden grants. Schools near the neighborhoods most targeted by the misconduct were assigned new oversight boards. But beyond the policies, it was the quiet that lingered. The kind of quiet that made people stop scrolling, stop talking, just to sit with what had happened. She did not return to the media. She did not release a statement. Instead, she continued her work in silence, one file at a time, one forgotten case after another. Her face became a symbol, not because she wanted it to be, but because people needed something to hold on to. And as word spread of what she had done, more people stepped forward with stories they had buried years ago. A janitor from a courthouse in Ohio, a nurse from Louisiana, a bus driver from South Carolina. Each story different, each story the same. They had all been told to be quiet, to forget, to move on. But now, someone had stood still, had refused, had turned back. The system did not shatter all at once. It groaned, it creaked, it stretched, and where there was silence, there was now testimony. Where there was fear, there was now the sound of doors opening, not with noise, but with decision. And somewhere, in a room with no cameras, no applause, no audience, she sat across from a woman whose son had vanished into paperwork 3 years ago. She listened, took notes, asked questions, then promised what no one else ever had: "We will look again." That night, as the courthouse lights flickered off floor by floor, she stepped outside into the cold and let the air hit her face. Her phone buzzed once with a new name. She did not hesitate. She walked forward, because justice does not sleep and dignity is never trash.